Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion, Edible Narratives, the interplay of food, culture, and identity, the first forum of curriculum integration spring 2025. Curriculum integration is a biannual initiative held every spring and fall semester where we explore interdisciplinary approaches to literary studies and their practical applications. By bridging different fields of knowledge, this platform makes learning more dynamic, engaging, and connected to real world issues. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to invite Head of Department of English and Humanities, Professor Arifa Ghani Rahman, to share a few words on curriculum integration and its significance in our academic journey. Arifa Ghani Rahman, Head of the Department of English and Humanities.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Hello, everyone. So, this being in this room brings back a lot of memories because we spent so much time here. And for a lot of you, probably this is the first time you've entered this building. And so this is the first time in this auditorium as well, but this holds a lot of memories for all of us. And I'm happy to be able to conduct this program here today. This is the 11th curriculum integration. So this is something we've been doing for the last several years to try to help our students to connect some real world issues with your course contents. So you have already probably had these discussions in your class with your course teachers about the projects that you may develop to be showcased at the end of the term. And the best projects will win a prize, a monetary prize. So get working on those projects. And these forums, we'll have one today and one next week. These forums are meant to help you to understand the theme and also get some idea of how you can connect your course contents with the theme. All right, so this time we've had several serious issues before, but this time we thought we would make it a little more lighthearted maybe, or you never know, you'll see how serious food can be from our speakers. So let's get on with it. I won't spend any more time with this, but I'm looking forward to all your projects, all the very interesting creative things you can come up with at the end of the term. So good luck. Oh, and I must thank our speakers. How could I forget that? I'm really, really grateful to Manzoor sir, Shamsad sir, Anika madam, and Jahanara madam for agreeing to do this. And thank you, Manzoor sir, for coming up with this idea of doing a panel. So we'll try to keep it interactive and interesting, and hopefully you will all enjoy the session. Thank you. And to all you, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arifa Ghani Rahman. I'll take my seat. Now it's time for us to dive into today's discussion. Today we focus on an emerging field in literary studies, gastrocriticism, and that's why the theme was chosen. An approach that examines the deep interconnection between food, literature, and society. Food is more than a sustenance, as you already know. It is culture, memory, identity. Through literature, we see how food reflects social hierarchies, migration histories, gender roles, and even political resistance. Today, we have a distinguished panel of scholars who will help us unpack these themes and more. Let me introduce them, and as I introduce you, please join us on stage. We have with us Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam, Professor Emeritus, University of Dhaka, and Professor at the Department of English and Humanities at ULAB. One of the most prominent literary scholars in Bangladesh, whose expertise spans post-colonial literature, cultural theory, and literary criticism. We are very happy to be joined by Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam. May I request you to join us on the stage? Thank you. We also have with us Professor Shamsad Mortuza, Professor and Special Advisor to the Board of Trustees at ULAB. an academic known for his work in literature, folklore, and cultural studies, bringing valuable insights into the intersections of literature and oral traditions. Professor Shamsad Mortuza. We also have with us Anika Tahsin, lecturer at the Department of English and Humanities, whose research interests include existential nihilism, criminal psychology, 18th century war and trauma, and she's also a foodie. Anika Tahsin, please join us on stage. We are also happy to be joined by Jahanara Tariq, lecturer at the Department of English and Humanities, and also a creative writer with a strong focus on experimental fiction and methodological retellings. Jahanara Tariq, please join us on stage. Thank you, honorable panelists. Let's get on with our discussion. I will start with Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam, or maybe Shamsad sir, whoever wants to go first. Okay, so let's start with Professor Manzoorul Islam. As you all know, gastrocriticism, it's a field that bridges literary criticism with food studies. I would like to ask Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam, how do you see this approach contributing to our understanding of literature?
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. I was given initially the responsibility of giving a lecture for an hour and boring you to death, and on such a lovely topic as food. So I decided that we should have a panel discussion so we can share our thoughts, and you have three very excellent speakers. We'll regale you with all the delicacies that you can imagine in this kind of discussion. Now, back to the question that Oliver San has asked me. Gastro-criticism is something which is, I believe, should be subsumed under the larger frame of food culture, because it's about eating practices, for example, culinary practices. There is always a critical analysis of everything that goes on in the preparation of food, the serving of food, eating habits, and all these things. But I would like to refer to the larger field because that also involves the politics of food. You have this question later. All the questions that you are asking, in fact, fall into this category called food culture. I have been involved in this studies for a few years in the 90s when I was member of an Asian food culture club. So we had regular meetings in Bangkok and in China. I attended 3, after which it folded or the food dates expired. And so I had some readings which are dated, but I'm very much aware of what is going on in current situation. So the question you raised is gastro, always reminds me of gastric. Gastro-criticism is something which is recent, particularly the theoretical aspects of this particular. But food criticism is very old. And food cookbooks also make judgments of people on the basis of their ability to eat and feed others. So the older ideas are also relevant today. I'll refer to, and Kaisar Hok is here, so he will instantly relate to this. The ancient Indian Purana is Ayurvedic Samhita, which is a 5th century AD, 5th century BC work, in which you have various instructions on the preparation of rice and lentil dishes, and how food should be preserved and not wasted. All these things are included. So that's also very important in the context of the time in which food was so precious. And then you have a Latin one written by Apicius, which is De Re Coquinaria or Culinaria, which is the way food is prepared. That also has recipes and all the instructions that come with making the recipe palatable, and generous amount of advice as well as recipes. So that should be the basis of our food criticism to ancient civilizations, thinking ahead in course of time, because food has been so important in all civilizations. Now, the recent emergence of gastrocriticism as a critical field of study, which has provided a kind of culinary lens to all food ideas and discussions of food. In my opinion, it coincides with the rise of theory, particularly structuralism and post-structuralism in the West. Arifa's note, Oliver Sun's note, mentions Levi-Strauss and how he made a difference between the raw and the cooked food. Raw food, he was primarily talking of mythology, but then he was also talking about society and culture. He believed that raw food is uncooked, which means natural food, and cooked food is something which is cultural, and then it has become traditional food for us. So that binary or the axis in which you place raw food, natural, and cooked food, artificial in the sense we spend a lot of time preparing the food, that I suppose also tells you many things about the food and the ideas that go with it. Roland Barthes, another very important critic of the time, of 60s, who was a structuralist, post-structuralist, anthropologist, as well as a semiotics specialist, he suggested that food is a system of communication, a language, and at the same time, it is a signifier. And food is something that tells you more about the people who create the food items, serve food. In other words, it's a signifier of how society thinks about everyone. And he also wrote a book, an article you can look up, Toward a Psychosociology of Contemporary Food Consumption, in which he talks about how food ultimately is something that creates a system of images, a collection of images which carry the meanings in a visual way, as well as, I suppose, gustative way possible. And so this is my take. I believe that this has opened three things this gastrocriticism has done. First of all, it is alerting us to different modes of preparation of food and the history of food, production, distribution. Marx, for example, talked about hunger. He says, hunger is hunger. But when hunger is satisfied by cooked food, and you eat this with the help of knives and forks, that sends a message about hunger. And hunger, when it is satisfied by eating raw meat, which is torn into and put into your mouth with the hand of your hands, nails, and claws. So Marx was not a food expert in that sense, but he was instantly talking about the kind of difference between, or let's say his criticism of society based on money and unequal distribution. We'll talk about these things very soon. So I believe that's the first thing it has done. It has alerted you to the various historical, sociological, and other practices. The second thing, which is also apparent in the questions that you have asked. Gastrocriticism has given us a symbolic meaning of food, how this symbolic meaning can apply to everything that you do. You walk down Shatmoshid, this road, and you have no less than 20 restaurants. And in the evening, I can see long queues forming outside this forest lounge building. That tells you one picture of a society. And just outside, I once saw a TCB truck and another line forming there. So that is the kind of inequality which slaps you on the face. That is also something that gastrocriticism alerts you about. And the last thing is, it doesn't take the enjoyment of food at the same time. Food began from home and traveled through the world. And so the home in the world is a long journey of food. And you have also included many topics like migration. I believe food also migrates. And all these recent developments of food, the post-colonial developments, globalized world developments, McDonaldization of the world, all these things also fall into place when you discuss gastrocriticism.
Sir, I would like to move to Professor Shamsad Mortuza, if you'd like to add to that, because I think Sir has already pointed out several issues which are very close to what you already focused.
So absolutely, so how many of you heard the phrase, "You are what you eat"? Right? So many of you, right? So whatever you consume, that shapes you, your identity, who you are. So there was a satirical take on this phrase, I think it's Channel 4, and the series was called "You Are What You Shit." Right? Sounds gross, right? Especially at lunchtime. So we already have some food for thought, all right? And Levi Strauss was mentioned. So the book, The Raw and the Cook, and Sir has rightly pointed out the binary that it creates. So raw is normally associated with what? So our primitive self, so when you eat raw meat, so that's considered savage, you are a barbarian, you're not, cultured enough to cook your food. But cooked is a metaphor for civilization. So for Levi Strauss, it's a journey from the raw state to the, cooked state. And usually in my class, I talk about, so when I teach Freud, I refer to this image. Say, for example, when you go to a Chinese restaurant, or if you go to KFC, so you're expected to use knives and forks, right? So even when you are, so you have ordered fried chicken, you're expected to use some sort of utensils. But at home, so you can have your chicken, without any protocol. So you can crush the chicken bone to the powder, so, you can crush it really, but you can't do it at KFC, right? Or you cannot do it in a Chinese restaurant. So the ambience determines how you eat. So when you talk about gastrocriticism, so we talk about what we eat, how we eat, who gets served first. It's our mom cooking, but usually, so as the, eldest son, I get to eat the first parota, right? So my mom will make sure that, I am well fed, and the proof is in the pudding, right? So this whole idea of food can create this binary of us and them. And Sir was mentioning a very powerful image of, all these queue, if you go to Forest Lounge, you have a long queue for the elevator, so people want to go up, have a buffet meal. And then you have the food truck, another long queue, so the have and have nots, the us and them, but it's not a civilizational divide. So it's a matter of you have the have and you have the have not. And when you have read Great Expectations, for example, so Miss Havisham's, that rotten, dinner table, with all the rotten food. So you have a lot of food, but you did not have the heart in it. You feel betrayed. And in the process, the food has, gotten, so wasted and rotten. Now, in contrast, when you read Great Gatsby, so you have this affluent, so dinner, which is a symbol of waste. So it's the same kind of like contrast, so that we see in society. So when we talk about food culture, like, so it is so out in the open. So sometimes we tend to ignore, maybe just a short note, so write a short note on this, write a short note on that. But to think of food as, an underlying theme in literature, so that demands like, special attention. And that's exactly what we are doing here today. So to think of it, so if you have read, say, for example, Midnight Children, right? And so Selim Sinai, the protagonist, so he has this pickle factory. And so he carries this jar, like, so and there's a slogan, like, so in preservation of memory, like, so this idea is that jar is a container of memories. So you have food, but all these ingredients, so they represent, say maybe olive, maybe mango, maybe some other fruits, but they tend to represent the different groups, different caste, different class. So in the pickle jar, so if you think of India, like, after independence, so you try to think of some sort of harmony that you'd like to have. But the irony is, like, it has to be spiced up, right? So you have these images. So what we are going to do, like, and I talk about, as a panel, so we're going to help you with some of the examples that you may have encountered in different courses, different textbooks. And we would like you to reflect critically on those ideas. I'm sure, like, many of you have read, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, right? So if you have done romantic poetry, so the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So remember the albatross? So it had the food that, it had never eaten. So what happens when you bring a new food to a culture? So the same idea goes for Turkey, all right? Thanksgiving. So when the colonizers, the Puritans, so they went to America. So they were tired, fatigued, like, so they ran out of food. And the Native Americans gave them turkey and roasted potato. And now we have Thanksgiving, right? And I remember in one Miss Universe contest, so I think it was Jerry Springer was asking the contestant from Turkey, so what do you do during Thanksgiving Day? And so that poor woman, like, she had no clue, why she was asked, like, what do you do in Thanksgiving? Because you eat turkey, right? So you need to be scared, like, if you're a Turkish girl, so you should be running away. So what do you do? And so she could not answer the question. And I think that is probably the reason why Turkey has changed its name to Turkey. So it does not say Turkey anymore, right? So food is powerful. So we will come back to these ideas a lot. So I think I will stop here now, and then, like, so there are other questions, so we can take it up. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And you have rightly pointed out, if you all remember, I think we have a large audience, so I would like to request you to all remain seated and please maintain silence. And if there's a shortage of seats at the back, you can also come to the front. We have some empty seats here as well. So please find yourself a seat at the front. Thank you. And as Sir has already rightly pointed out, I think if you would also remember how olive and watermelon have become symbols of resistance for Palestine is also another way we can think about food as well. To avoid censorship, they have started using watermelon as a replacement for the Palestinian flag, which is of the same color scheme. So with that, I would like to move to, I think, Jahanara and Anika, whoever wants to go first. I think we'll start with Jahanara. If you can mention a few texts maybe from the course and how we can incorporate food and food waste to understand how belonging and alienation are functioning in those texts through food and food waste. If you want to add to that.
Right. Thank you so much for your question. And so I was thinking about it very like specifically last night when I was thinking, because I do think a lot of our students, they're very excited about the whole CI thing, but a lot of them are somewhat a little nervous and a little confused about how to go about with it. So the courses that I normally take are writing for literature, and there is a poem that's very popular with the students. It's short, it's very visceral. It's called Barbie Doll by Marge Piercy. And yeah, we see the sight of the female body is an object of desire, and even the words that are used in the poem, words like consummation and hunger and desire, it's inextricably related to the devouring of the body. So we see that sort of connection with between like eroticism or and the actual devouring of the flesh, right? And the feminine body as an object to devour. So I think for those of you who are doing like feminist literary courses, women in literature, writing for literature, I think that could be a very interesting way to look at the CI forum to sort of evoke how feminist writers have dealt with food and literature, specifically with the idea of desire and eroticism and such. To give another example, I also teach fiction and nonfiction, and the most obvious thing, I think, the first sort of thing that we all thought of, I remember talking about this with Anika, was A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift. And so I heard about food and literature, and I was telling this to Ittifapo as well. I'm like, I'm not thinking about any food, but I'm thinking about cannibalism and Jonathan Swift. And again, how this metaphor of food is related to power structure and the ultimate sort of dehumanization of the body, where you are only as good as like literally what you put on the table. So definitely think about that. Think about like food and power, and it's explored very literally in Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, but you can definitely like find a pipeline over there. Right, and I'll just mention one other text. I also taught restoration last semester, and I had the loveliest batch. And I remember just going on and on about like the culture of that era and the importance that third spaces like coffee houses and chocolate rooms had, right? In like just the spreading of that, the age of enlightenment is associated with those third spaces. So it is a place that is not just for your physical nourishment, but coffee houses and chocolate rooms would also have shelves of books that could, and you could like borrow those books. Books were really expensive at that time. So intellectual nourishment as well. But also like a play like The Way of the World starting at a chocolate room. It's so interesting because like it has that cheeky little thing. And I feel like it sort of like even the setting foreshadows the wit and the lightness and the cheekiness of the whole play, right? The flirtatious aspect as well. So I feel like that could, and then like the artificiality of it all as well. So in terms of like the courses, I think these were some of the things that I could think of, but there are so many other ways in which Castro-centric criticism can be like sort of tied down to the literature that we're reading. I mean, of course, we're going to talk about like migration and maybe a little bit more about like feminist issues and stuff. So yeah, thank you. I'll pass on the mic to Anika, maybe.
Anika, would you like to add to that?
All right. So I think Manzoor sir, Shamsad sir, and Jahanara has pointed out some really important aspects. So I would like to start with my interpretation of food, how food expresses. So for me, food is a form of expressing one's existence. And if you guys observe, I had the honor of teaching a multiple array of courses. So if I may start with fiction and nonfiction, as Jahanara pointed out, that when it comes to food, it is a way of expressing one's emotions, one's identity. I mean, think about R.K. Narayan's The Guide, Raju. Do you guys remember how at the later part of the novel, he used to hide food from the villagers of Mangal? If you notice, it is not only his
habit of not being able to go out starving, but it was also an expression of his character, his sense of manipulation, the way he was also hiding his true character, true identity. He was corrupted. And corruption sort of reminds me of the society. When it comes to a society, as Jahanara ma'am pointed out, the chocolate room from the way of the world. Of course, it is about the aesthetic, it is about the ambience and everything out there. But at the same time, if you observe, there is also a sense of pretense. Remember? When the characters are sitting around and having this intellectual or so-called intellectual conversation, they are actually plotting against each other, right? Also, when it comes to food, identity, and culture, you would often notice that the authors have their way of expressing themselves. When it comes to the guide, it is Raju's constant need for coffee, filter coffee. However, as we move to A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway, it becomes the alcohol, right? And the alcohol is not only about the drunken state of the character, the old man. No, it also expresses his alienation, the loneliness that he feels, right? So if you actually observe, in our society, in our culture, we have this habit of sort of interpreting that, okay, this person consumes this sort of a food, so perhaps this is how they are. For instance, the old man who is clearly an alcoholic, but can we call him a bad man like Raju? Can we? We can't. Right. Also, in 2024, I attended a conference at Syed where I was introduced to a theory which is actually a part of the BBA department, Maslow's hierarchy, which is about the survival needs of human beings. And it is very interesting that how food is one of the top requirements. That would actually make me to go a bit away from our course. Have we watched the movie Ghetuputra Kamola? Yes, we have watched that. And do you remember how Kamala's father brings her to this landlord, right? This zamindar. And as Kamala is about to get, abused, molested by this landlord, this zamindar, his father is presented with a big plate of food with pulao and gorur mangsho, right? And the father is not worried about the consequence that his son is going to face. The awe in his face, in his expression, go mangsho. He goes like this, right? Go mangsho, right? Here you are seeing that the society is creating this need for existence, this need of expressing oneself. And sometimes it makes us question the intention of the people around us and the people who are also very close to us. If we sort of move towards the sense of existentialism and food, think about American Literature 1, Bartleby the Scrivener. He rejects food. He was being offered food by the lawyer. The lawyer was bringing him food at the prison, and he rejected it. We love food whenever we are stressed, as Oliver Sun's son, Sir, said that, most of us are foodie, particularly me, as I was introduced. When I'm stressed, I love food. But imagine an individual being so distraught. Imagine an individual being so much in pain and not wanting to exist that they do not want to enjoy food anymore. So when it comes to food and identity, I would later on talk a little bit about culture as well. Culture has its own way of selecting food and representing it. But particularly when it comes to food and identity, it not only shapes an individual's personality, but also the way they are existing in this world. So thank you so much.
Is that like to add, like when you talk about existentialism, Pope, I was also thinking of like Camus and his very famous quote, right? Shall I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? I mean, that's just, it's so simple, but I feel like it sort of encompasses so much. Sometimes it is like a really good, clean cup of coffee that can stop you from annihilation. False words, yeah.
Absolutely.
And I can definitely relate.
Or suicide, perhaps. Or suicide, perhaps. I think that, Manzoorul, because I think a couple of the points that you were mentioning also brings us to the idea of how sharing and withholding food can also be an exercise of power. So if Manzoor sir would perhaps add to that a little bit about how the exercise of sharing and the ways of sharing, and in fact the ways of withholding food can and in fact be an exercise of power in literary texts, perhaps.
Okay, that takes us to a longer historical perspective about production of food, sharing and caring. When the hunting society settled down and became agricultural society, the Homo cornus, the farmer man, was an anonymous self. He provided food for everyone. But when food was in abundance, then somebody took control of the food. And then there was hoarding. And in 1943, we had a famine. It was man-made because of hoarding. Why is it so? Because food is power. And as the late lamented Anthony Bourdain suggested, food is the most political thing in the world. So power is something which comes with politics. Power comes with class, privilege, and food somehow represents everything. Food is real. On the internet, this is virtual. Food is a commodity. And when I quoted Marx, he was referring to England's second cultural revolution, agricultural revolution in the 1880s or thereabout, which transformed agricultural production and industrialized a lot of this production. And he was worried that now there will be artificial needs created, which this anonymous farmer never even dreamed about. So food is also spectacle. If I'm allowed to use a French philosopher's words, Guy Debord, he says that we are living in a society of spectacle. Spectacle is, of course, show, but more than that, it's material investment to produce the show. I mean, the other day I went to a wedding where I hardly want to eat because it is so lavish sometimes. And this family went out of its way to make the food a spectacle. Why is this so? Because they want to impress. This is an image. It's a branded thing now, food items. Food is present, everywhere is real, but food also reminds you of the absence. Now, we talked about food and identity and all these things. Inevitably, they will come, but how many of you are aware that about 60% women in our country fall into the category of the absences, whose connection with food is very almost visceral. Now, in agricultural production in our country, 50% of the labor is provided by women. But the food they grow or help grow, that food is never given to them according to their needs. So hunger is a constant companion, or at least malnutrition is a constant companion of these women. If you withhold food to most of the women of your country in this cruel way and provide a superfluity of it to a particular privileged class, then you are creating a moral crisis, which ironically food is contributing to. So we have famines created by withholding food. We have created the large absence, which speaks loudly of most of the people who don't care. When you walk past the beggars on the street and get into secret recipe, you know this store, secret recipe is not secret anymore, then you are creating a pocket of absences. And you are very happily filling this up with all the decent food you can buy there. So this kind of anomaly in human production, consumption, and distribution of food is something that I suppose literature deals with. You know, Oliver Twist is a very favorite novel of mine, in which you have the idea of food being an instrument of injustice. And I can name a number of works, I forget, I mean, COVID has been very recent. The other thing, let me finish this by showing you how this absence is so important. It can produce other considerations centered around food. I taught Macbeth for some time, and Macbeth has a feast in which food is, by the evidence of the text, absent. And in The Tempest, you have, on Prospero's order, what's his name, Ariel, organizing a feast, and then the feast disappears. Because this is tied to the idea of guilt, of sin, of everything that you do, which an absence of food can somehow point out more strongly than ever. And as you like it, remember the two hungry persons going to the forest, and they were invited to a very lavish lunch or dinner, I forget, suggesting that there is a reward for everything that you do, your honesty, your sincerity, your friendship, and your virtue. And that honesty comes in the shape of food. So that's very simple. Withholding food means there are people who work behind withholding institutions, all the agro industrial corporations of the world. Ukraine, for example, produces most of the grain in the West. And you will find that if half of the grain is not produced, a lot of countries in the world will just starve. And one of the instruments of torture in the world is this starvation. War is created to punish one group by another group. The stronger group punishes the weaker group with war, and one of the instruments or weapons of the war is hunger. So it's a very difficult topic to discuss in 5 to 10 minutes, but I'll leave there. Maybe Shamsad can be more educated.
No, you have rightly pointed out the absence of food, so hunger, and I was thinking of course Shukanto, right? So this jhalshana roti, like Khudar Rajya Prithvi Gautamani, right? So this idea, like as Adorno said, like it is barbaric to talk about poetry after Auschwitz. So when you have Palestine, so when you have UNRWA being stopped, so supplying food to Gaza, it is probably a luxury for us to talk about food and have a seminar like this or a CI forum like this. But having said that, that's the reality of it, right? As Sar was mentioning, like, if Ukraine is stopped from providing grains to the rest of the world, like, so others will supply. And you have seen it in things fall apart, like, so Kunkus, like, this yam supply, like, that was symbolic of the fall of Okunko, like, the wealth is, taken off. So the idea of hunger and leading to some sort of revolution is again found in La Miserable, right? So the very first image, like, John Valjean, like, so he stole a loaf of bread, right? And then punished for that theft. And just like what we are seeing today, like, so there are so many jobless people. So we can always blame that, mugger, like, so we can always blame those people, like, on the street. But how many jobless people we have after this July Revolution, right? So this unemployed. So if you are hungry, so what do? Right? So that's a big question. So we are just looking at the symptom, but we're not looking at the underlying system that has created that symptom. So when you talk about food, so you need to talk about, those ideas, so underlying that process. So I think so while you talk about food, it is equally important for you to talk about hunger. So Jahanara was mentioning modest proposal. But I think we can also look at Gulliver's Travels. So for example, when Gulliver, so the Lilliputians got fed up, feeding, Gulliver, right? So the huge amount of food that Gulliver, the man mountain, required. So they needed to dispose him off. So just like we are fed up with our Rohingyas, right? So the Rohingyas have become our Gulliver, right? So they have crossed the ocean, come to our land, and now we are fed up feeding them, right? So we need to think of these ideas like, so it's not that easy, as, Mortuza was saying. So this whole idea of like, who is feeding whom. So again, another reference from Gulliver's Travels. So, and Sir was saying that food has been weaponized, right? And we can always think of India stopping onions, so, so there's just one ingredient and there's a huge, hue and cry, right? So the same thing happens in Laputa, in third book of Gulliver's Travels. All right, so the floating island. So if you revolt, what they will do, so they will bring that floating island, and so there'll be shadows and there'll be no crops, and eventually, so you have to surrender, right? So when you think of food, so how food is also used as a weapon. So weaponization of food can be another good way of negotiating this topic, right? So I can think of many other examples, but maybe I'll stop here, like, in the interest of time, because I know there are flurry of questions.
I think we'd be able to cover them all, but with that, I think we will move to some of the practical applications of this framework, because that would perhaps help the students the best. So maybe Anika and Jahanara can respond how the students can integrate literally and figuratively the frameworks and understanding of food and food waste into their studies, and maybe some of the projects that they can come up with. If you have any suggestions, uh, any of you can go. Maybe Anika can start.
All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, that I did not talk a lot about how food and culture work together. So, here, I would actually like to start by talking a little about Indubala Bhater Hotel. There is a novel by Kollol Lahiri, and there is also a recent series. So yes, right. And when it comes to Indubala Bhater Hotel, it is not only about food. It is not only about culture. It is also about how gendered Indubala is. When she gets married to this alcoholic, and yet it is expected of her as a woman to offer the macher matha to her husband, right? How she is often taunted by her mother-in-law that you cannot use these specific spices in your cooking, and how that amtel, right, that mango oil that was prepared by her grandmother was so close to her heart. It not only shaped her identity, it allowed her as a character to merge her culture, her individualism with food. Keeping that in mind, the same we can say for our courses as well. For instance, if I may point out Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, we have a lot of presence of food and how food plays an important role in that particular text. For instance, we have still not started with the Duchess of Malfi. However, for the students who have already done the course, when the Duchess gets offered that apricot by Bossola, it is not only a realization for the Duchess that she is becoming a complete woman, she is going to give birth to a new life. But you can also perceive that apricot as a betrayal from Bossola, because the Duchess trusted him. The Duchess saw him as her friend. And if we think about, let's say, the text, Dr. Foster's, think about the Pope's character, the way he consumes food. He sits at a very important position in the society. He's the representative of the Roman Catholic Church. However, his love for food and the way he cursed at his subordinates when Foster's was messing around with him, right? Taking away his wine and his food, we get this realization that, all right, this man is not an apt person to be a representative of the Roman Catholic Church. Yes, gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, also shows his greed as well, right? Think about Foster's, and he sort of denounces the fact that it's okay, there is no health, so I can enjoy, I can feast as much as I want. His gluttony, but at the same time, also his reluctance to accept the accountability for his actions, to understand how badly he has messed up. Right. When we think about, let's say, fiction and non-fiction, food is not only there to help us understand how the characters are shaped, but you will see that each particular text has its own way of displaying the author's culture. As I have mentioned earlier, for Raju, it is idli sambar, filter coffee. When it comes to Ernest Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, alcohol. But think about Pride and Prejudice, the boiled potato of Mr. Collins, right? Something that is not only a representation of the bland food culture of England, but it is also a representation of his bland personality and how boring of a character he is, right? Apart from that, think about Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart. Even then, we see mention of a lot of things, but food. In fact, the anonymous narrator, they talk about a lot of things, but not about how they are sustaining, how they are surviving. However, there is a sense of consumption even there. Their sense of consumption lies in the fact how they are enjoying torturing the old man. So that is also something that I feel that you guys can connect. When it comes to a particular topic, a particular theme, it is about how out of the box you can think. It is about the theories that you can apply to it. And as I often say in my class, you need to decode what literature and the history is offering you. Of course, with a logical take, but you should always try to think how it can be perceived in a different manner. So thank you so much. This was from my end.
Jahanara? All right. So, and I think also those of you who are doing modernism in literature with me and have done modernism in literature with me, most of the texts, in fact, have food images, and they play a very crucial role in narrative shifts, in shaping the characters that we are talking about. So, from oyster shells in T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock to the pasta in A Farewell to Arms, we do have texts which are saturated with food and food ways of narrative shaping. So I think with that, let's move to another topic, which is many of you have already mentioned about, I think, being famished and food being a marker or symbols of cultural identity. I think food can also function as a great source of understanding migration. From chicken tikka masala in the Great Britain to, I mean, I don't know, even many of our food items are in fact saturated from kachi to borhani. A lot of the food items are, or sushi for that matter, yes. You see a lot of Thai restaurants in Dhaka these days. There's a boom in Thai restaurants, apparently. So I think maybe Shamsad sir can add to that, how food and migration function together, perhaps in literary texts as well, if you can bring up a couple of examples.
Of course, was thinking of Monica Ali's Brick Lane, of course, right? And so if you think of Nazmeen, like, so when she goes to London for the first time, so she used to cook panta bhat, like, so the typical dishes from Bengal. But later on, so she starts experimenting, like, so adding indigenous spice to, the foreign dishes, right? So the fusion. And so Monica Ali has deliberately used that food metaphor, right, to make that transition going, right? But at the same time, like, so this is very common, like, again, Jhumpa Lahiri, like, when Pirjada comes to town, like, you have scenery edges. So when Pirjada comes, so he'd bring Bengali sweet. And then, so for his honor, in his honor, like, so a typical Bangladeshi cuisine would be served. But at the backdrop of, so the 71 war, like, so they'd be watching the news on TV, and Pirjada would stop eating at that time, right? So again, this, consumption of food and the, wait for the violence to be over. So authors do use, this kind of metaphor. But in terms of migration, so I also already mentioned this idea of the Native Americans, and so, and the trade-off, the cuisine trade-off. Sir was mentioning the Anthony, so that famous show, like, so where he goes to Vietnam to taste, street food, right? And now we have Master Chef and so many food contests. So even our own Keka Ferdowsi with all our noodles dishes, right? So, like, so food also travels, like, so foodies travel, but with them, food also travels. And when you travel, like, so you bring your own food, right? So the mobility of food is very important, and it started with Adam and Eve, the forbidden fruit, right? So food was forbidden, like in one particular food was forbidden, but then you have curiosity, right? So, and food is also kind of, so maybe we need to mention this also. So it's socializing aspect of it. So we also need to mention it. So you are doing Buell, for example. So in Mead Hall, so mead is a honey-based wine. And that is the gel, like, so that glues society, the Anglo-Saxon society together. So the wine would be served by the queen herself, and the, so the heroic society would come together, right? And then, of course, you have, there's a divine food, like, milk and manda mentioned in, say, Paradise Lost, right? So you have certain food with which you associate divinity, right? So some sort of culture marker. So milk is actually a very good example, say, from Hera's breast, like, so the milk has flown and the Milky Way has been created, right? So that's the other aspect of food, like, so how this is not only migration from one country to another. So food also travels from one sphere to another sphere. So from the micro to the macro, from the mundane to the divine. So when you are looking for food images, so try to understand the location of food and how this food is being dislocated and how it's traveling from, one palate to another palate, and what kind of trade-off, is being done. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I was also being reminded of sugar plantations and how that has in fact led to the creation of different kinds of literature. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, just like with the migration question, I was thinking of this essay by Chitrita Banerjee, who's an amazing food critic. She has these beautiful essays, and she got married to a Muslim man who lived in Dhaka, and she was brought up in she grew up in Kolkata in this like Jomidari Bari Kolkata, and she has these beautiful essays talking about the puja celebrations and how it's different to the Eid celebrations over here in Dhaka. The exuberance and the colors of that in contrast to the the early prayers, the quiet sacrifices. I think it's really interesting, that sort of contrast, and we don't really. I mean, of course, there are those quintessential migration stories like Sarah has talked about, but this one. If you all haven't read it, maybe you could really look into Chitrita Banerjee's essays. Very interesting. And also, like, in terms of power, and this is something that I was talking to Anika about as well. she has this one essay where she talks about the housemaid who is crushing up the spices, right, and using the boti to like cut up the fish, and she's crushing up the spices and such, and she has like a white cloth as sort of like a niqab of sorts, right? And she's covered her mouth with that so that her breath doesn't, you know, touch the spices. It doesn't go through into the food, and it's and like when the author is writing about this scene, she is thinking about her childhood when she's and looking into the whole thing. And she's on one hand, she's very excited about the food that she's going to have later and about this really jolly personality of this woman. But also, even as a child, she's looking at the body of the woman, sort of crouched against the boti and crushing it up using all her might, this tiny little woman, elderly woman. And then in her mind, she's like, oh, how atrociously, like, what an uncomfortable scene that is. And it really touches her. And the cherry on top, of course, is the cloth over her mouth and her nose, because she belongs to a different caste. She's not being able to, like, you know, it would get contaminated if the puja food is like, yeah, if she breathes in through that. So yeah, and I thought I just wanted to like mention it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahanara. Yes, please.
I think this is also going to help since we were talking a little bit about food at a class. So here's the thing. Think about the modest proposal from fiction and nonfiction. When Jonathan Swift calls the children, like 5 to 6 year old boys who are stealing food, thieves. What does a 5 to 6 year old child understand about stealing? For them, it is just survival. So even there, you can see this class discrimination. If it was done by a privileged child who belongs from a good family, a family with money, they would just be described as, you know, mischievous, perhaps, cute. But just because this is being done by a poor child, they are being described as a thief. So I think this is how you can sort of go through the texts and try to decode the underlying meaning that the authors had in their mind when they were writing such texts. Thank you.
Add to that, so this idea of caste, so for example, in God of Small Things, so you have like, so lovers from two different castes, like an Ammu and Veluta, but it's, shown through the sharing of a mango, right? So they're eating mango together. So that is kind of transgression. So having this food together. So just like, so Jahanara was talking about having this piece of cloth so that the caste does not contaminate the fish. So again, so look for images where, so this kind of particular image has been used or accessory has been used. So Manzoorul was talking about Roland Barthes' essay. So in which, like, he describes, a pasta, so in a red and green background, and then you have the pasta almost coming out of a, bag made out of, strings. And so the image is actually helping us to think of the authenticity, the domestic space, the Italian nationality, right? So whenever you're dealing with a food image, so look at the accessories, associated with that image, so that whether they're trying to tell, something else, something beyond what is being provided. So the symbolic nuances, that's what this panel is all about. So we come across this, idea of food, but what is going on? Like, why the author has curated the images or processed those images in a certain way so that it can help us, go to a deeper level.
I think Manzoor, sorry, if you'd like to add to that, perhaps.
Add to the idea of
Migration,
theory, yeah.
Even food as a site of nostalgia and even negotiating hybrid identities
Exactly.
in literature.
I teach two courses. Used to teach two courses in the undergraduate. One was post-colonialism, and the text that we covered, and post-modernism, and some of the text we covered. Post-colonialism deals more with migration and the reasons for migration. Earlier mentioned the um, sugar plantations, right? And many Indians, bonded laborers, were taken to the West Indies, the Caribbean islands, and were given jobs there. So that's one kind of migration leading to different kind of cultural traits. And if you read V.S. Naipaul, you get to understand their food cultures are very strictly original as much as possible. But divisions within families are becoming very prominent as young members of the family opt for the Western food items. That's the whole idea of how colonialism had divided cultures, hybridized cultures. Food is one item which has been heavily hybridized. Like in Dhaka, the Chinese dish is not the original Chinese dish. I have been in 2 Chinese cities, and both are excellent. They have very excellent culinary histories. And there, the people scoff at Chinese food sold elsewhere in the world, except the small towns or big towns. Why is this hybridization? Because you have been denied food on the one hand, and plenty of lures are created through branding Western food so that you opt for that kind of a food. And not only food, along with the food, you are supposed to use Western ways of eating some foods. And that creates another hybridization. You go to a pizza house, for example, what's this one? I forget. You will find people asking for knives and forks to eat pizza. I believe in postmodern terms, this is very valid. Anything goes. So who are you to tell me that I cannot use knives and forks? Are these your own paternal property or something? No problem there. I once wrote an article back in my Asian food culture days. It was titled, "The Empire Cooks Back." I'm sure you were aware of Empire Writes Back. Now, why do I say that? Because my first visit to England was in 1976. I stopped there for 7 days on my way to Canada, and I was given a kind of a taste of British food, fish and chip. I thought, it's so terrible to taste, I would rather eat grass, which is maybe more tasty. And people probably, they realize that food is very bland, so they opted for curry. And now you know what? In England, the national dish is curry. So when the curry restaurants emerged in London and other cities, there were 10,000 restaurants run by Bangladeshis. And they changed the British taste eternally. And now the British fish and chips, and my last trip was in November, and I tasted fish and chip just for the heck of it. And that has undergone a sea change. The sprinkling more spices and then that, impossible. So this is called the Empire Cooks Back. And you know how much money those restaurants earned by this trade and sent to Bangladesh? Is a lot of it. Now, I suppose you can apply things your own way, but my advice would be to you, don't use a theoretical frame too pedantically or to sort of as if you will die if you do not follow this particular theoretical frame. But theoretical frames help you organize your thoughts in a systematic manner, narrow down your focus, and then discuss things from multiple perspectives. That is never a miss, because all these perspectives, even if they clash, will lead you to some kind of understanding of the topic that you're selecting.
Thank you, sir. I think in the interest of time, we are going to open the floor for questions. So if any of you have any questions, you can raise your hand and we can pass on the mic. The floor is open for questions, comments, queries, anything. Do I see a hand at the back? No questions? Clarifications?
Suppose only they,
Okay,
okay.
there's one question there.
But
So
I believe
I think
most
I'm
of you
gonna-
are too tired to listen anymore. You need food, maybe.
Hello, I'm Siri. I'm a student of sixth semester. Okay, whatever. So I wanted to ask, so I'm doing ancient Greek literature this semester, and I understand the dynamics of the food and the impact of it in literature, but since ancient Greek is a very ancient literature, so I am struggling to uh, find the definition, or how should I say, how to interpret the food in that term. So I would like to hear your opinions or about that. Thank you.
No, are you doing King Oedipus? So you have the plague, right? And there are no crops. So the entire crisis, so begins with an idea. So I think, that can be one point of departure. What other takes do you have? Okay.
And there's frogs, but we are not, that's after the meat. So I'm currently focusing on Oedipus, but I don't know how to like connect it with food and stuff
Okay,
like
so
that.
we will have follow-up sessions where your course teacher will be helping you. So
I think in Oedipus you also have meat, right? Like, uh,
Remember how we talked about the gods who loved to consume mortals as a sense of satisfaction? Also, food or consumption, as Shamsad sir pointed out, that Oedipus Rex begins with a scarcity of food at Thebes, right? So often it is not particularly directly about food, but the scarcity of it, or how it is also influencing a particular setting or a set of characters. But I would definitely reflect more on that during the classes. All right. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add something. Do you guys have Sappho in the syllabus? Yeah. So I think Sappho has a lot of poems which uses a lot of food imageries and such. I mean, yeah. So just wanted to sort of, I definitely look into her poems. She has manna, like the whole heavenly streams of milk and honey, apples, apricots, figs, a lot of that, like very interesting, like, erotic, beautiful imagery. So yeah, I just want to add my 2 cents.
I think we have one question at the front. Do we have any more questions?
can I share an anecdote?
Please.
Okay. So what's our national fish? Ilish. All right. So I was hoping there'd be a question on Ilish. So it's actually, sir, Mama to Syed Mustafa Ali? No. Nana. Sorry, Nana Hochin Syed Mustafa Ali. And he mentioned this, so this, have you heard this idea of Tugloki Kando? So this Mir Tughlaq, so there is this Mughal king, so he wanted to taste Hilsha because Hilsha is famed for being savory and whatnot. All right. So once he started eating Hilsha so much, so he liked it so much, he kept on eating, and eventually he had diarrhea and he died. So this poor king died, after eating Hilsha. So this idea of Tugloki Kando, so, and going back to the Greek myth. So the entire Trojan War started with Eros throwing this apple, so there was a banquet, and so the Eros threw this apple, golden apple, saying that for the fairest one. So again, you have feast, and the feast being disrupted. So the entire chaos, the Tugloki Kando, started, because of that intervention or disruption, however you call it, right? But another important thing, so you also need to relate food to your own personal memory. for example, often you will see, people reminiscing and saying that, so char bhitore glucose biscuit chubai khawa, like, biscuit ta dube jawa, like, so, yeah, and also like, so pranam shatto, like, this old man, like, so he has this bar of, sam shatto and goes back to his memory, tapre staff ke boka dite bhule jay and all that, right? So that's something that you can also think of, like, so when we were growing up, so আমাদের জন্য সেরা সন্দেশ, so Satyajit Ray, Shira Sandesh. So Sandesh being news and Sandesh being food at the same time, right? So when we read Tenida, for example, Narayan Gangopadhyay, পটল ডাঙ্গার প্যালারাম, সে শুধু মানে ঝোল খায় হচ্ছে শিং মাছের ঝোল খায়, রাইট? কিন্তু টেনিদার তার হচ্ছে নাক, যে কোনো জায়গায় যদি একটু সিঙ্গারা কস্তুরীর গন্ধ পায়, সে চলে আসে, মই নাকের মতো তার নাক, সে চলে আসে, right? So this kind of idea that nosy, like, and Selim Sinai has the same, naku narrator, সে একই সাথে নাকে যে কোনো গন্ধ ই করতে পারে. So look for those sensory images. So the purpose of this idea is that SR is saying that you don't need to be too theoretical, so try to relate to the lived experiences and how those experiences are translated into a literary text. So that's the main purpose of this curriculum integration. So you need to learn how to integrate what you're taught in the classroom. So we don't want you to simply reproduce what ChatGPT says. Previously, it used to be what SparkNote says. Now, so just because you cannot just copy and paste ChatGPT. So you need to internalize. So that's the very purpose of this, forum.
Want you to add something?
Just a little bit about Syed Mustafa Ali. Now, he used to say that the surest way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I asked him once, what about the surest way to a woman's heart? And he says, well, they are a better species. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We have a question at the back, and then we'll come back to you if that's okay. Can we pass the mic, please, at the back?
Thanks for giving me the floor. My name is Jahanara. I'm second semester from English department, obviously. First of all, I want to appreciate the topic. It's very, very interesting. So over here, you mentioned two words. It's food and identity. So in our society, some people identities were known as for being foodie. And at the end of the day, they get bullied for being foodie. They get mocked for being foodie. So over here, you put two of these words together and encourage us to talk about it and show something related to it. So how do you see it? Like in today's day, it's not that in a positive light. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Do we bully foodies? I don't know. I mean,
No, we get bullied. Oh, like, can I use a slang in Bangla? আরে তুই তো খাস, তুই তো পারবি। আরে তুই তো এটা করতে পারবি। আরে তোর জন্য তো এটা কোনো ব্যাপার না। So like, it's that type of thing. And some people actually gets mentally affected due to it. So yeah, we do get it.
I mean, if that makes you happy and you are not harming anyone or insulting anyone, why should it bother you?
I mean, like for this forum, you put this together and encouraged us. But in society, like for people, it really don't go that well. Or some people are also known for eating less, and it go the both way. So that's what I want to say. I want to hear something related to it from all of you.
All right, may I add my personal take to it? So for me, society is very much like divided into different booths, and the people of the society, they would go from one booth to another, judge, might not buy something, and move on to the next one. So I mean, as long as you are enjoying it, you're learning something from it, and most importantly, if it makes you happy, I don't think you should be bothered by it. Rather, you should be interested more into learning about it, right? For instance, most of the students here know that I consume chotputi every day, and I describe it as salad. That's my way of looking into chotputi. So I think be a bit more confident. Everyone gets judged, even gods. So we are just human beings.
I'll just add to that, like, so as long as your metabolism is working, right? So this is the right time for you to eat and burn that calorie. Like now that so I'm like 55, Monjusa is 75. So we need to watch our, diet a lot. So we don't get that question. So for us, so we need to check our, so diagnostic report before we decide what to eat and what not to eat. But, so yeah, so enjoy your food, but make sure that you burn it, because you need food, right?
I think you've rightly pointed out the construction of identity through habits of consuming food. So I think that's rightly pointed out, and it does attract criticisms in many different ways in society. Do you want to?
I mean, oftentimes if like consuming food is a performance of sort, like we were talking about like raw food versus cooked food. And last night for the preparation of this panel, I was also looking into cannibalism and vampirism, whereas like the former is treated as something that's absolutely repulsive. There's something very dark, almost romantic and exciting and thrilling about the idea of vampirism. But it is, both of them are essentially acts of consumption and acts of, domination, right? But the latter, there is a sense of refinement to it. There is wealth, images of wealth and aristocracy related to that. So, similarly with our consumption of food, if it is performed well, and we were talking about like utensils and foreign cultures and such, if it's performed well, oftentimes it's said to be like, okay, that person is not a foodie, perhaps a food connoisseur, yeah. So we definitely should change things up.
And I think we also should keep in mind that food habits are also politically and economically and culturally conditioned. So it's not something that we necessarily grow up with, but rather we learn. So I think we also need to think of food habits in those terms.
I'll just add to that, so this is a recent trend, so with vegan being very, popular and all that, and also sustainability being a buzzword. So when I was doing my PhD in London, I remember I'm a poor student, right? So I would, bring my 50 pence Nescafe to the classroom, and my classmates would laugh at me because they have brought their almond milk, frothy, so cappuccino decaf, whatnot. So that would cost my liver or kidney. So, and they would actually judge me, for my vending machine coffee, right? So yes, you will be judged, so, and that's how it is, so, but I was thinking when Anika was talking about chotpoti and salad. So, you go to McDonald's and you see people ordering, can I have a double cheeseburger with extra cheese and a Diet Coke? Okay. So again, so look for ideas, look for images, so the world is a fun place, right?
Ma'am wanted to add something.
Thank you. That was a really tasty discussion. Everyone's hungry, I know, so we'll try to wrap up very soon. But I think one thing, not a question, but sort of I was thinking about, food as a builder of community. And when we were talking about migration and people, leaving their homes and going abroad. So what do they do there? They actually tend to sort of try to build their own home away from home. So, for example, ঈদের সময় সেমাই লাগবে, এখন সেমাই আমি পাচ্ছি না, তাহলে কি করব? So I substitute with maybe thin spaghetti or something. So, taking those foreign ingredients and then making it our own and using food as a sort of coming together, an excuse for coming together, and that's across all cultures. Like you mentioned Thanksgiving, so that's also it has become a tradition now, the Thanksgiving, Christmas. Family gather together around the dinner table, everybody cooks, everybody gets together, they share memories and so on. And then also, Bangali culture ki ache, je keu kichu achieve korlo, ai khawa. Bhai, ami kaj korlam, ami koshto korlam, ami খাওয়াবো, আমাকে খাওয়াও. But that's the way we celebrate. So food also is a way to celebrate. That's also something that's, I think, a big part of that community and, creating that connection between food, culture, and identity as well.
On that note, say we don't have any entertainment. So food is the only entertainment. For middle class, Dhakaite, so food is the only entertainment. So you just go and eat out, right? So, yeah.
And I think that also reminds me, we had Poila Boishak, just after a couple of months. And I think food is a very important element there. And not just in Bengali culture, but also in Chakma culture. You have Boishabi, where you have a tradition of eating, at least in 7 houses, this dish called pajon, which is made of both uncultivated and cultivated vegetables. So it's quite interesting to think of the ways food are integrated into our communities and the way it can also act as a bridge to build communities and sustain them. So I think if we don't have any more questions, okay. We have one more question. We have 2 questions, in fact. Okay. All right. We'll try to wrap it up in 10 minutes. So yes, we'll that would be just the last question. Then yes.
Sir, as I'm doing the modernism course, so that course I want to relate it with the poem, the love song of Alfred Prufrock. When we think about the food, there is the edible narrative. So how can we connect the sensory emotion and experience with the personal identity?
Other questions, and maybe we can ask.
Sir, and also the cultural heritage with the personal identity, with the representation of the love song of Alfred Prufrock.
We have quite a specific question, and then we have one question at the back. We're going to take the 2 questions together, and then we'll wrap it up. So yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to ask you the question. So, as we were talking about how food brings people together, how it's a medium of celebration, I would also like to acknowledge that it also brings people apart. And what do you think about that? Because very small information from our recent course that we're doing right now. So we're doing a drama right now, and there we see someone making a dessert at night to separate 2 lovers. So that also makes me think that food is indeed also a medium of separation for many. So what do you think?
Also an apple, yes, right, in Snow White.
Apple of discord. Anything else? Any other question? Oh, there is another question here. But yeah, food for thought.
Hello. So the question was about, we saw Italian people get offended if we eat pizza like in the crust way, or we crush the spaghetti to boil it. So if in this world 2025, we accept fusion, like it's okay to fusion the things together. So if we are keeping things together, like we are giving our elements to a new food or experimenting something, so is it okay to mix up the culture together, or it should be different to the other cultures, or it should be unique in their own way? Is it okay to fusion the things together or not? It was my question.
So I'll just respond to the second question. Maybe others can. So this idea of food as a separator. So see, very interestingly, so 2 traditional football clubs in Kolkata, so Mohammedan and East Bengal. So East Bengal, সেখান থেকে ঘটি and Bengal. So Bengal, who have migrated from this part, right? So after any football match, what would happen? So এখান থেকে যারা গেছে বাঙালরা তারা ইলিশ মাছ রান্না করে, হ্যাঁ, এবং অনেক পেঁয়াজ দিয়ে। আর অন্যদিকে যেদিন মোহাম্মদ তারা যেতে সরি ইস্ট বেঙ্গল যখন, তখন চিংড়ির, হ্যাঁ, মোহনবাগান, সো তখন ওরা আবার চিংড়ির মালাইকারি করে, কারণ দে ডোন্ট ইট so পেঁয়াজ দিয়ে ইলিশ মাছ খায় না। So again, so yes, you're very right. Food can be separate, and of course, you have seen beef-related lynching. So India te prochur lynching hoy, food near, and kosher, so for example, we are also debating at a wine glass say ken mind korte pare, right? So again, konta kosher na, konta halal na, so that's again a very important question, right? So again, apple of discord, right? But onnogulo jodi if you want.
Also, I think there's a recent news where there is the mangsher bodole jhol dewar karone dui poksher সংঘর্ষে 15 জন আহত। From that to, in fact, even the use of beef fat in bayonets, and that's leading to sepoy rebellion. So I think also in those terms. Yes, Fiona.
Yeah, just like with the separation question, I think the biggest separation in the history of Judeo-Christian story, there's something that you mentioned, right? Adam and Eve got discarded. from heaven for eating that apple. So food actually precedes sin. It is the ultimate form of pleasure. It's the first act of disobedience. And it's the biggest separation of all. It's the separation that created like our identity as human beings and such. I mean, in literature at least. So yeah, that's the first thing that popped into my mind.
We had two more questions, in fact. One was about proof work and identity, and the other one was about fusing or fusion. I mean, I think, mixing different cultural elements or maybe foods together. So if any of you would like to respond.
The culture is dynamic, so fusion is inevitable. So as Arifa was saying that, say ঈদের দিন সেমাই নাই, so spaghetti দিয়ে সেমাই বানানো, right? So so improvise, and that's what fusion is all about. Say sir Chinese কথা বললো, authentic Chinese. I have Chinese friends যারা বাংলাদেশে Chinese পছন্দ করে, right? So they think like, our Chinese is actually better than their Chinese, right? So again, it all depends like, so how you process it, so yeah.
As long as I think if we avoid appropriation, so যে শুটকি আমরা বাসায় খেতে পারছি না, বাইরে যে একটা তো অনেক দাম দিয়ে ওটা কিনতে খেতে পারছি, so yeah, so we need to kind of give credit where credit is worth.
And that reminds me যে আমার আম্মা যখন বাসায় চটপটি রান্না করে, so কখনোই মজা হয় না, like তখন আমার আম্মা বলবে কি, জানেন, আমি শিওর তোমাদের আম্মাও বলে যে আমি তো ঘাম দিয়ে রান্না করি নাই, so আমি তো সর্দি দিয়ে নাক ঝেড়ে রান্না করি না, মজা হবে না কেন? So দেখবে যে দোকানের চটপটি সবসময় মজা, right? It's compared to, so again same with halim and all that, like so again, so appropriation is important. I think
You want to add something?
Just somebody mentioned proof work, right? Proof work is not food is farthest from his thought, right? But proof work reminds us of two things. First of all, how lonely he is. And a recent study has suggested that most Americans eat alone. And that takes us to the second idea of how modernism had created a paradox to begin with. Cities were created for people to live together. And in cities, you are the loneliest. And how do you deal with it? Sometimes food comes as a friend to loneliness. And most obesities in the West are now created by two things. One, the fast food things like McDonald's, and many other ways of eating the junk food, which is basically junk. And secondly, people who are in a psychological crisis in which they need to forget the pressure of whatever is putting them down, pressing them down. People eat a lot. Sometimes you eat for no reason at all. And you are not being disrespectful to others, but you are being too sort of unmindful of what you are doing. That's another problem. And then how food was something which was a family ritual. And how many families will be in 10 years from now eating their lunches and dinners together? Right now, in many houses, children are not available if they have grown up. And eventually, single family apartments, they won't like to cook. So Uber and Food Panda are the answers. In Singapore, which was a very thriving port city, trading city, long time back, the Chinese, who were the majority there, used to have food together in family surroundings. Now you go to Singapore, it's another version of Manhattan. But there are food courts in every housing area. And food courts are the virtual, not real meeting places, not virtual, but it gives a virtual understanding of community. Because at the end, old people who sit with other old people and have their dinner will go back home and face a very lonely night. I suppose what Eliot suggested from very beginning of 1920, he was looking at the turn the world was and culture was taking. And that turn was from the Victorian age and whatever Victorian age, the values they upheld, and then gradual loss of a center and then eventually replacing the center with all fake centers. So in postmodern age, the fake has become real. So we are not sure which food is fake and which food is real, because many people will use the market to promote food, which is basically dangerous. Can anybody tell me if this thing called Horlicks is something that gives you, ensures your admission to Mensa Club? But why is it everybody is just probably buying this particular drink? Maybe it's good, but it's not a replacement of the kind of family care a child should be given, and the nutrition which our civilization has failed to provide to the children. So this fake cannot take the place of real. These questions you must ask yourself, I suppose, after this particular seminar is over, and which I don't want you to ruin your lunch or your dinner with these kinds of questions. But these are important for you to go to the roots of the problems they will feel in your world. Many of you will start your families and your days will begin with a worry what to cook. It's kind of Hamletian, what to cook or not to cook. Okay.
So can I just quickly add, like, sir mentioned food panda and the overconsumption, like, so, and I think one term would be like, binge eating, right? So we binge eat, so cheka khele tumi ki goro, like, ice cream pura 1 liter ice cream boshe porla, right? So that is again another important thing, like, so the psychosomatic connection with food, right? So why you have craving, ekhon chanachur na khele cholbe na, right? So again, the physiological aspect of it and the psychosomatic aspect of it. So this is again another area that you can touch upon perhaps. So yeah.
Yes, I think we can, do you have anything to add? If not, we are going to close this panel. Thank you for such an exquisite panel discussion. And thank you all for participating. Next week, we have the second forum of curriculum integration. So I would like to invite you all to join us for forum 2 in coming up next week. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you all for joining us today.